So our last step for this week is going to look at public opinion during the and policy during the Bush second term, so 2005 to 2008. And one of the things you can see from this chart is that favorability opinions of the U.S. declined fairly significantly throughout Western Europe, and these are among allies of the U.S. during the Bush years. I mean, Germany has the biggest drop from 78% favorability to 37%, and there are similar declines in the Middle East and in East Asia, albeit from lower starting points. Favorable opinion of the United States and Turkey by the end of the Bush administration is under 10%. And this is a reaction to the war in Iraq and to Guantanamo Bay and Al Ghraib and the use of torture and humiliation among the prisoners from both the Afghan and Iraqi conflicts. The Homeland Security apparatus put together by the Bush administration does successfully avoid any other al-Qaeda-like attack on the United States during the Bush presidency, but that doesn't mean there aren't significant terrorist attacks. Instead, the targets are on Western allies. In 2004, in the run-up to the Spanish election, al-Qaeda organizes an attack on the Madrid train station. As you can see from the photos, this is a devastating bombing. The goal is to influence the election, to tilt the affair to the left of center party, the socialists, who opposed opposed Spanish participation in the Iraq War, and replaced the more conservative incumbent who had supported the war effort. And indeed, the socialists win and pull the Spanish out of the coalition. On July 7th, 2005, there are bombs on the London subway and on buses within London, organized by al-Qaeda sympathizers to punish the British government for supporting the Iraq war effort. This is a particularly alarming attack in that the al-Qaeda 9/11 attack on the U.S., these were all carried out by foreign nationals who were able to get into the country, usually using student visas. The 7/7 attacks in the UK were carried out almost entirely by second generation immigrants, that is, people who were British citizens, and as a result, it was much harder for the security apparatus of the British state to follow them. So terrorism, even though widespread, full-scale terrorism in the U.S. doesn't resurface after 9/11, it's not as if the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq lead to a terror-free environment in the West. It's just that the area of terrorism shifts. And the Bush administration is attempting to deal with this. Bush does shake up his national security team during his second term. He's not a fool. He realizes that things haven't been going well. He weakens the power of his vice president. He largely sidelines his defense secretary. And the two dominant figures on national security during the Bush second term, the first is David Petraeus, who he appoints as the commander general of U.S. forces in Iraq. And Petraeus comes up with this philosophy known as the surge. And the idea is to bring in more U.S. troops in Iraq with the goal of pacifying the country. And once it's pacified, and particularly once this largely Sunni resistance is put down, then the U.S. can pull troops out. And this program, by and large, works. The military situation in Iraq is better in 2008 than it was in 2006. So Petraeus is one. The second is Condoleezza Rice, with whom Bush is very close intellectually. They had good working relationship. Rice had been national security advisor during Bush's first term. And when Colin Powell decides he doesn't want to stay as Secretary of State, Bush nominates her to take over as Secretary of State. And so she'll serve from 2005 to 2008. She emphasizes diplomacy far more than was the case in the Bush first term. And one of the things she attempts to do is to try to rehabilitate the U.S. Standing internationally. She is a great believer in democracy, the idea that encouraging democratic reforms in U.S. allies will, and other recipients of U.S. aid, will ultimately benefit the U.S. Position strategically. And as a result, she embarks on a couple of quite disastrous policies. The first is her strong encouragement of the Palestinian Authority, this statelet in the Middle East. So here we have the West Bank and Gaza that had been created. This is not an internationally recognized state, but the idea of the Oslo Accords, which were signed in the early 90s, was to create a process by which Israel and the Palestinian leadership would negotiate, and eventually there would be an independent Palestinian state under multiple conditions. Those negotiations, at the end of the day, never really go anywhere, but nonetheless, the Israeli government does implement these Oslo Accords to give the Palestinians a significant degree of autonomy on domestic issues. The PLO, its political wing is Fatah, had governed these lands since the Oslo Accords. The Rice, and they get a lot of assistance from the U.S. as a way of preserving security. So Rice pushes the Palestinian Authority to allow free and fair elections. The problem here is that Fatah is not a party that is actually prepared to hold free and fair elections. They're corrupt, they're divided. And the elections that occur, as you can sort of see from the map, represent a pretty sweeping victory for Hamas, this extremely hardline organization whose founding charter is riddled with anti-Semitic statements, and which, unlike Fatah, which had at least nominally abandoned terrorism, Hamas is a terrorist organization. And they win because they're better organized. They have there's a social welfare component to Hamas, so they have support within the community. And one of the lessons from the Palestinian elections of 2006 is that at the end of the day, the West can't just sort of impose democracy from without. You need some kind of civil society which to have democracy. This election does not actually have any meaningful effect. The two sides split. There's a coup in Gaza. Hamas drives out its rivals. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority continues to lead. Abu Mazen, who is the current president of the Palestinian Authority, is currently on the joke is on year 17 of a 4-year term. And the reason for this is that he knows that if he actually has elections, he's likely not to prevail. So this is the first the first initiative that really backfires in terms of this idea of promoting democracy. And the second is in Pakistan. This is General Musharraf, who was the military dictator of Pakistan throughout the 1990s. The U.S. works with him in the post 9/11 Afghanistan war. And so in the 2000s, even though the U.S. had imposed a degree of sanctions after Musharraf takes power in a coup, Pakistan gets showered with U.S. assistance. But Rice, again, wants to see a democratic government in Pakistan. The idea is, look, we need to restore democracy as much as possible. And she's a strong supporter of this woman, Benazir Bhutto, who is Western educated. She's the daughter of the former prime minister of Pakistan. She herself had served a term as prime minister and then is toppled in a military coup. She's both popular in the country and controversial. There were rumors of corruption, especially surrounding her husband. But Rice brokers a deal between Musharraf and Bhutto, in which Musharraf agrees to invite Bhutto back to her homeland. She had been in exile in the UK, and to transition towards elections where everyone assumes that Bhutto and her party likely will prevail. And from the US standpoint, this is a win-win proposition. It allows for a free election in Pakistan, but we're still going to have a pro-American leader. It will just be Bhutto rather than Musharraf. The problem is that there has developed by this point in Pakistani history what amounts to a state within a state, the ISI, which is the Pakistani intelligence agency, which has a close relationship with the Taliban, is the entity that is basically safeguarding bin Laden in Pakistan itself, and is not eager to see its power weakened by a new democratic government. Bhutto returns to the country. She's very quickly assassinated. There's massive, understandable recriminations over this, whether the Musharraf government protected her, whether there's an assassination plot by the ISI. But as with her Palestinian initiatives, Rice's initiatives towards the Pakistanis betray a degree of naivete, the sense, oh, we can just encourage democracy and things will get better. During the Bush second term, what increasingly becomes apparent is that while there is a boundary line here, this red line between Afghanistan and Pakistan, that in effect the green area here, which is primarily Pashtun, makes this boundary meaningless. And you see Taliban operatives that move across the border, between Afghanistan and Pakistan relatively regularly. And if you think back in this course, we've encountered a similar kind of situation in the Vietnam War, where you see these the communists move into Laos and into Cambodia as necessary. So this is a general map within the Pakistani state, in particular, this one province up here in the northwest, called the Northwest Frontier Province, increasingly comes under the control of forces allied with the Taliban, or indeed in these reddish sections, the Taliban itself. So basically, what the Taliban does is that even though it's been driven out of Afghanistan, it decamps into the border regions of Pakistan, and rebuild under the sponsorship of the ISI, this state within a state within Pakistan. So the result is, by the end of the Bush second term, the Taliban has revived. It's begun to carry its military efforts back into Afghanistan. And what seemed like a convincing victory over the Taliban in 2002, by 2008 seems like something very, very different. And of course, bin Laden still hasn't been captured. There's one other, I think, important foreign policy initiative from the Bush administration, because it's going to set up things that will come later on. And this is very late in the Bush administration, associated with events in Georgia, this very small country that declares independence from the Soviet Union when the country collapses. And we sort of see on the map, it borders Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and then Russia to the north. Georgia throughout the 1990s was governed by Gorbachev's former foreign minister, a man named Edvard Shevardnadze, was very well liked in the West, but becomes increasingly authoritarian as a leader of his country. He was ethnic Georgian, even though he was leader of the Soviet elite. And in 2004, he's pushed aside in what's called the Rose Revolution. There are these color revolutions throughout Eastern Europe. There's also the Orange Revolution in Ukraine that will push aside a corrupt government that had been elected through election fraud. And these developments, these color revolutions, particularly worry and especially since the advocates of the color revolutions tend to develop a pretty good relationship with the U.S. government. All of this particularly worries the new leader of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. Remember, we've looked at him before. He resigns due to ill health. And is replaced by a former KGB officer who we all have come to know and love, Vladimir Putin. And Putin, whereas Yeltsin at least was willing to play the game with the West, Putin is not. Putin wants to reestablish as much of the former Soviet empire as possible. He's very worried about these color revolutions because he thinks that eventually one of these color revolutions might very well hit Russia and get rid of his government, which has become almost entirely authoritarian. This brief window in which there were more or less free and fair elections in Russia in the 1990s gives way to a Putin de facto dictatorship. And so late in the Bush years, the Russians precipitate a conflict with Georgia. And this is a tactic we'll see them use again with Ukraine in 2014. They send troops into Georgia, into separatist areas. So the tannish areas here on the map, on grounds that they are merely protecting ethnic Russians who are trapped within this what they see as an anti-Russian country of Georgia. And the result is a military conflict between Georgia and Russia. You can see on the map here the Russian inputs. Russia is not interested in annexing Georgia. It merely wants to send a message through this campaign that to these bordering countries, look, if you challenge our government and you align too closely with the United States, problems may emerge. And ultimately, the Russians prevail in this war. They occupy these two areas of Georgia. So the result is a dramatically reduced country in size. And by this point in the Bush administration, the backlash against the Iraq War has become so intense that even if the U.S. were inclined to send troops to Georgia, which it was not, or even if the U.S. were inclined to very aggressively support the Georgians in the diplomatic realm, which was not inconceivable, that would not have been possible due to the backlash against the Iraq War. So Georgia is significant partially because of what happens to Georgia, obviously, but because it sets this precedent in Putin's mind, and we'll be looking at this the week after Thanksgiving, in which aggressive responses on the borders of the Russian state seem to be unlikely to be met by the U.S. And that's what we have for snippets for this week. Hope everyone is well and have a great Thanksgiving.